Hello, welcome back to our series on LangChain4j framework. Today in this tutorial, we are going to cover the chat model interface in very detail. First, we will start with the basic understanding of the chat model interface. Then we will see what all different methods we have in case of this interface. And then we will create a sample application wherein we will work with these methods. Now let's quickly understand what is the chat model. So when it comes to the LangChain4j framework, chat model is an interface using which we can interact with the large language models. So here you can see we have the skeleton of the chat model interface. It consists of several methods. Some of these methods can be used for interacting with the large language models, while the others can be used to get some metadata. Now before we cover the chat model interface in detail, let's quickly understand the request flow. As I mentioned earlier, with the help of chat model, we can interact with the LLMs. Now, in order to send the request to the LLM, first we will have to create the chat request object. Once the chat request has been created, we need to send this request to the LLM with the help of chat model. And once the LLM has processed our request, we will get the reply. And during this whole process, if we have to perform certain additional operations, like if we have to add any additional logic before sending the request to the LLM or after receiving the response from the LLM, then we can do that with the help of listeners. Now this is the another diagram that we have created, which contains the details about various classes which we will have to make use of while working with the chat model interface. So at the very center, you will see we have the chat model interface. It accepts some input, and once the request has been processed, it will produce some output. Now in order to send the request, we will have to make use of the chat request class. And when it comes to the chat request object, it can hold the information about the various messages. Also, it can hold certain additional parameters which can be utilized for fine-tuning the response which is produced by the LLM. Now, in order to specify the messages, we have the ChatMessage class. In order to specify the different parameters, we have the ChatRequest parameters class. Now, once the ChatRequest object has been created, we will send it to the chat model interface. Chat model interface will forward this request to the actual LLM. And once the LLM has processed the request, it will produce the output in the form of chat response. When it comes to the chat response object, it contains the information about the AiMessage, which is nothing but the output which is produced by the LLM. Also, it contains certain additional metadata. When we say additional metadata, it contains some useful information like the finish reason. Also, it contains the information about the tokens that were utilized for processing this request. And during this whole process, if we have to add some custom logic or if we have to observe our request, that is where the chat model listeners comes into the picture. Now, if you look at the documentation of the chat model interface, these methods will start making sense. For example, in order to interact with the LLM, we have the method with name chat, and here you will see we have 4 chat methods. Each of them accepts some different kind of input, and most of them produce the output of type chat response. Now, apart from chat methods, we also have the doChat method, which is also useful for interacting with the LLM. The only difference is behind the scenes, all these 4 chat methods called the doChat method. And when it comes to these 4 chat methods, they also set some context which is required by the listeners. When it comes to the doChat method, the concept of listeners is not applicable. Our request will be directly sent to the LLM. Now, apart from these chat methods, we also have certain additional methods like default request parameters method, which will produce the output of type chat request parameters, which will contain the information about the default parameters that are set for our chat model. Similarly, we have the listeners method, which will return the information about the various chat model listeners that are configured for our chat model. Similarly, we have the provider method, which will return the information about the provider that is supporting our application like OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on. Then we have the supported capabilities, which will return the output of type capability. Now it contains the information about the advanced features that are supported, for example, whether our LLM can produce the output in JSON format and so on. Before we create our demo application, let's quickly understand how we can create the object of these different types. So starting with the chat request object, On the left hand side, you will see chat request object can hold the information about the various messages. Also, it can hold the information about the various parameters. Now, when it comes to the messages, these can be represented with the help of chat message interface, and these messages can be of various types. For example, when it comes to the chat message, we can have the chat message of type system message, which is nothing but the instructions that we usually set for the AI. For example, here we can specify the behavior or personality for the AI. We can specify the role or constraint for the AI. Then we have the user message, which is nothing but it will contain the messages that are sent by the user. Then we have the AI message. It will contain the information about the response that is sent by the LLM. And then we have the tool execution result message. It contains the result about the tool calls that are done by our LLM. So this is some advanced feature which we will see in our upcoming tutorials. Now when it comes to creating the object of these different types, we can create with the help of constructor. Somewhere we have the from helper methods. Also somewhere we can make use of the builder pattern. For example, if you have to create the system message, we can create with the help of new keyword wherein we will specify the role or behavior for our AI. And then we can also create the system message using the from keyword. Again, we can specify the instruction for the AI. And if we have to create the user message, we can create with the help of new keyword and the from static method. Similarly, if we have to create the AI message, it can be created with the help of new keyword. Also, it can be created with the help of builder pattern. Now we understood the chat messages types. Now let's focus on the chat request parameters. Now coming to the chat request parameters, with the help of this, we can fine tune the output which is produced by the AI. So we have the various set of parameters that we can set. For example, we can set the model name, which is nothing but the LLM to make use of. Then we can set the temperature, which controls the randomness and creativity in the output which is produced by the LLM. Then we have the top P, using which we can control how many words the model can choose from. Then we have the top K, which controls how many of the most likely words the model can choose from. Then we have the frequency penalty, which can be used to reduce the repetition in the output which is produced by the AI. Then we have the presence penalty parameter, which will encourage the AI to introduce the new ideas or the topics. Then we have the max output token, using which we can limit the length of the answer which is produced by the AI. We can set the stop sequence, which will tell the AI to stop generating the new text as soon as it encounters these words that are mentioned in the stop sequences. Then we have the response format parameter, which will allow the AI to produce the output in certain format. Like we can specify whether to produce the output in the text format, which is default, or even we can instruct the AI to produce the output in the JSON format if it is supported by the LLM. Then we have the parameters related to tools, which we will see in our upcoming sessions. Now if we have to create the chat request parameters object, this is how we can do with the help of builder method. So here you can see chat request parameters dot builder, and we can set all these parameters. So now we have seen the chat messages, we have seen the chat request parameters. Using this, we can create the chat request object. So if we go to the chat request, this is how we can create the chat request with the help of builder, chat request dot builder. We will specify the messages. These are nothing but the different type of messages which we have already seen: user message, system message, and so on. And also we can set the parameters with the help of parameters object that we have created like this. Now we have created the chat request object. We can send this chat request object to the chat model interface. In order to interact with the chat model, we can make use of the chat method. And once the AI has processed the request, it will produce the output in the form of chat response. Now let's understand the chat response object. So it primarily consists of two objects. First one is the AI message, which contains the output produced by the AI, and then it contains the metadata. So if we see the chat response object, it consists of the AI message and it consists of the metadata. When it comes to the AI message, it will consist of the actual text which is produced by the AI. And when it comes to metadata, it contains certain metadata like model which was used, the finish reason which will explain why the AI has stopped generating the response, Then it will contains the information about the token usage, like input tokens that were used, output tokens, the total token count, and so on. Apart from this, we have few other methods like the ID, which returns the unique identifier of the chat response, the model name, as well as the finish reason methods. So here you will see, once we have sent the request to the LLM with the help of chat method, it will produce the output in the form of chat response. And inside the chat response, we will have the AI message, which will return the result of type AI message. Inside that, we can call the text method to get our actual output, which is produced by the LLM. And if we have to get the metadata, we can call the methods like ID, model name, finish reason, and so on. And if we have to see the token usage details, we can retrieve that information from the metadata. For example, inside the chat response, we have the metadata. Then we have the token usage, which will return the output of type token usage. And from this object, we can retrieve the details like input tokens that were used, output tokens that were used, and the total token count. Now we have the additional classes like the chat model listener, which contains the various method within which we can specify our custom logic. For example, if we have to add any custom logic before sending the request to the LLM, we can specify it inside the on request method. Similarly, if we have to perform any operation after receiving the response from the LLM, we can do that inside the on response method. Similarly, while processing the request, if any error is encountered and if we have to perform any additional operation in that case, then we can do that with the help of onError method. Then we have the capability class, which will return the advanced features that are supported by the LLM. So currently we have only one value, response format JSON schema, which will indicate whether the model can return the response in the JSON format or not. Then we have the model provider class, which will return the platform backing the chat model. For example, we have these values like OpenAI, Gemini, Google Gemini, Olama, Anthropic, Mistral AI, and so on. Now, if you see the documentation of the chat model interface, you will notice we covered these different type of classes like the chat message, chat response, chat request, the chat request parameters, chat model listener, model provider capabilities, and so on. Now we can create a demo application within which we will make use of these different methods. Now when it comes to our project structure, basically we are going to create the Spring Boot based application within which we will integrate the LangChain4j and we will make use of the chat model interface. So the name of our application is going to be the LangChain4j ChatModel demo. At the very top we have the Spring Boot main class, and inside the controller package we have one controller with name ChatModel demo controller. Inside this demo controller, we will create different set of endpoints within which we will utilize the different methods that are offered by the chat model interface. Now inside the resources folder, we have the application.yml, which will contain certain basic configuration related to the LangChain4j. And then we have the pom.xml containing configuration related to our project. Now let's go through our Spring Boot project, starting with the pom.xml. Here we are making use of Spring Boot version 3.5.9. When it comes to Java, we are making use of version 21. And for LangChain4j, we are making use of version 1.10.0, which is the latest stable version available at the time of recording this video. Coming to the dependencies section, first we have added the Spring Boot Starter Web dependency, which will help us to create the REST APIs. Then we have added the LangChain4j OpenAI Spring Boot Starter dependency, which will bring all the dependencies that are required for working with the LangChain4j. And here we have added the OpenAI specific dependency. For our demo purpose, we are going to make use of the free models that are offered by the Open Router platform. And these models are compatible with the OpenAI standards. That is why we have added the OpenAI specific dependency. Inside the dependency management section, we have added the BOM for the LangChain4j, which will be useful for the version management. Now coming to the application YML, at the very top, we have defined the name of our application. And then we have set the configuration related to our OpenAI model. So here you will see inside the LangChain4j, we are setting the parameters related to the OpenAI. First, we have set the base URL. Since we are working with the Open Router platform, we have set the base URL of the Open Router platform here. And then we have set the API key. This API key will come from the environment variable, and we need to set our open router API key under this variable, which is open router underscore API underscore key. And inside the model name, we are setting the model that we are going to make use of. In our case, we are using the free model from the open router platform, and we are working with the DeepSeek R1. And then we are setting two flags related to logging request and response. Coming to the Spring Boot main class, this is the main class which will bootstrap our entire application. Now coming to our controller package, we have one class with name ChatModel demo controller. Inside this controller, we are going to create the different REST endpoints for showcasing various methods that we have inside the ChatModel interface. So starting with the controller class, at the very top, we have defined the base path for our endpoints, which is API v1 chat. Then we have created the 5 endpoints for working with the 5 different chat methods that we have in case of chat model. Then we have created one additional endpoint which will return certain metadata related to our chat model. And then we have created few helper methods that will be utilized while working with these different set of endpoints. At the very top, we have specified the chat model. This will be auto injected by the Spring Boot framework. Now coming to our first endpoint, which is the simple chat endpoint. Inside this particular endpoint, we are going to make use of this particular method, which is chat, which accepts the string type of input and produce the string type of output. So coming back to the simple chat method, here we are accepting the request from the user in the form of map of string of string. So this is how it is going to look like. We will have the field with name as message, inside which user will specify the query that it wants to send it to the LLM. So this particular thing will be mapped here. Now from this request, we need to extract the string message. So what we are doing here is, once we have the request, we are extracting the query which is sent by the user based on the key which is message. Once we have the user message, we will make use of the chat model. We will call the chat method and we will send the string message which is sent by the user. And once the LLM has processed the request, it will produce the output in the form of string. Once we have the output, we are sending this output back to the user in the form of map of string of object. So here you will see we are creating the response object. So the response which is sent by the LLM will be mapped inside this key which is AI response, and then we are sending the result back to the user in the form of map of string of object. So if we see the postman, inside the AI response key, we are mapping the output which is sent by the LLM. So this was the first method wherein we are sending the string type of input and receiving the string type of output. Coming to our second endpoint, which is chat with messages. Inside this endpoint, we are going to make use of this particular chat method which accepts the list of chat messages as the input. Now coming back to our IntelliJ. So in order to accept the request from the user, we have defined map of string of string. So this is how it is going to look like. So inside the request body, user will send the system message and the user message. Once the user has sent the request, it will be mapped here, which is map of string of string. Now from this particular request, we have to extract these messages. So for that, we are making use of the methods that are available inside the map. For extracting the system message, we are calling the get or default by specifying the system message as the key. If the user has sent the system message, it will be extracted. If user has not sent the request message, this is the default value which will be stored here. For extracting the user message, we are making use of the user message as the key, and then we are mapping it here. Once we have the system text and the user text, now we need to create the system message object as well as the user message object. For that, we are making use of the static helper methods. Here you will see, for creating the system message, we are calling system message.from. Then we are specifying the text that we have received here. Similarly, for user message also, we are making use of the static helper method from, and then we are getting the user message as the object. Now we have the system message object, we have the user message object. We need to send it to the chat model. So here we are doing the same, chat model.chat. We are specifying the system message, we are specifying the user message. And once the LLM has processed our request, we will receive the response in this particular form, which is the chat response. Now we have received the response from the LLM. We have to construct the response in this particular format, wherein apart from the response that is sent by the LLM, we have certain additional metadata like the token usage, the finish reason, the metadata containing model name and the response ID. So in order to create the same, we have created one helper method with name build detailed response. Inside this helper method, we are passing the object of chat response. So if we expand this build detailed response, first you will see inside this we are creating the map of string of object for sending the response. First thing that we are setting is the AI response, which is nothing but this particular field which contains the text that is produced by the LLM. So in order to extract that from the chat response, we are calling the AI message, which will give the object of AI message. And inside that, we need to call the text method, which will give the text response that is produced by the LLM. So this is how we are setting the AI response field. Then we are setting the token usage. For that, we have to create the token usage as the root object. Then we need to create these three different fields. For that, we have another helper method with name add token usage info. If we see that the token details are available inside the metadata, so we are calling the response.metadata. Then we are calling the token usage, which will give us the token usage object. From this particular object, we can extract the information like input token count, output token count, total token count, and then we are setting it inside these fields: input tokens, output tokens, total tokens. So here you will see we have three fields: input token, output tokens, total tokens, and these three fields are set inside the root object, which is the token usage. So this is how we are creating the token usage root object here. So once we have the token usage info, then we are adding the finish reason info. So inside the finish reason object, you will see we have specified the reason why LLM stopped producing the output. So the reason was stopped, which means the response was completed naturally. So if we see the add finish reason info, here you will see from metadata, we are calling the finish reason method, which will give the finish reason object. From that, we are extracting the reason and we are setting it inside the reason field. So here you will see inside the reason field, we are setting the reason. And finally, this particular reason field is present inside the finish reason root object. So we are setting it here. Now we have set the finish reason info. Then we are setting the metadata info, and inside the metadata, we have the model name and the response ID. So if we go to the add metadata info, here you will see first we are setting the model name. For that, we are calling the metadata and then we are calling the model name, which will give us the model name. And in order to set the response ID, we are directly calling the ID method inside the chat response. So once we have these two fields, we need to set it inside the metadata root object. So we are doing it here. So this is how this particular helper method build detailed response is helping us to create a detailed response that we want to send it to the user. So once we have the detailed response in the form of map of string of object, we are simply returning it back to the user and you will see this particular thing as the final output. Now coming to our third endpoint, which is the conversational chat. For this, we are going to make use of this particular method, which is the chat method, accepting list of chat messages as the input. So this particular method is useful when you want to send all the information to the LLM so that the context of the conversation is maintained. So coming back to our IntelliJ, now if we expand this particular method, conversational chat, here you will see again it is accepting the input from the user in the form of map of string of object, and this is how it is going to look like. So here you will see we are sending the list of messages and each message is of type chat message, wherein we are specifying the type of the message like system message, user message, AI message and so on, and then we are specifying the content. So here you will see the entire conversation context is mentioned. First, user define the role for the LLM, you are a math tutor. Then user asks the query, we receive the response from the LLM, and then the user is asking the follow-up question, multiply the result by 5. So inside this particular message, you will see the entire conversation context is maintained. So when user asks this particular final query, the LLM will be able to answer by looking at these previous messages. So now if we go to the IntelliJ, here you will see from the request, first we are extracting the messages, which is the list of map of string or string. This is nothing but we are extracting this particular part wherein the key is the messages. Once we have the messages, we need to convert each of the message into the chat message object. For this, we have created one helper method, convert to chat message. Here you will see for each message, we are extracting the type and the content, which is nothing but the type of the message, and the content, which is nothing but the query which is asked by the user. So here you will see once we have the type and the content, then depending upon the type, we are creating different kind of chat messages. For example, if the type is system, we are creating the system message. If type is user, we are creating the user message. If type is AI, then we are creating the AI message. Now, once we have the list of chat messages, we need to send it to the chat model. For that, we have the chat model.chat, wherein we are specifying the list of chat messages. And once we receive the response, which is of type chat response, then we are creating the detailed response with the help of helper method that we have already seen. And then we are simply returning it back to the user. So this is how the final output is going to look like. So if you see, the final query was multiply the result by 5. So the result was 20. We are asking the LLM to multiply it by 5. So the final answer should be 100. So here you will see the final response that is sent by the LLM. The previous result was 20. Now multiplying by 5 will give us the 100. And then we are setting the additional metadata with the help of helper method that we have already covered. Now coming to our next endpoint, which is the advanced chat endpoint. In this particular endpoint, we are going to cover this chat method which accept the chat request as the input. When it comes to chat request, it can have the list of messages. Also, it can have the various request parameters to fine tune the output which is produced by the LLM. Coming back to IntelliJ, this particular method will accept the map of string of object as the input request. Now, if we go to the Postman, this is how it is going to look like, wherein user can specify the different messages like system and the user message. Also, user can specify the various parameters for fine tuning the output which is produced by the LLM. Now, if we go to the IntelliJ and expand this method, so here you will notice at the very top we are extracting the user message and the system message. Then we are extracting the values for the different parameters. Once we have the parameters values, with the help of chat request parameter builder pattern, we are creating the chat request parameters object. And once we have the chat request parameter object, we are creating the chat request containing the parameters and also containing the set of messages. So we have the system text, we have the user text. Here we are creating the system message, we are creating the user message and setting it inside the messages. Once we have the chat request, we are calling the chat model.chat by specifying the chat request object. And once we receive the response in the form of chat response, we are building the detailed response in the form of map of string and sending it back to the user. So this is how the response is going to look like, wherein the request which is sent by the user is create a blog on Spring Boot. So inside the AI response, you will see the content which is given by the LLM and the other metadata is also mentioned here. Now coming to our next endpoint, which is the direct chat endpoint. In this case, we are going to cover this doChat method, which accepts the chat request as the input and produce chat response as the output. So if we go to the IntelliJ, for accepting the request from the user, we have the map of string. This is how it is going to look like, wherein user will send the message inside the message field. It will contain the query which is sent by the user. Once we have received the request from the user, first we will extract the query which is sent by the user with the help of key message. Now we have the user message. Next we need to create the request parameter. For that, here we are making use of the OpenAI chat request parameters builder method, inside which we have specified the model name and the temperature. Once we have the parameters, we have the user message. We will simply create the chat request with the help of builder method. Here you will see we are setting the messages, we are setting the parameters. Once we have the chat request, then we are calling the doChat method, which will give the chat response object. Once we have the chat response object, we are creating the detailed response and finally returning response back to the user. Now here you will notice we are making use of OpenAI chat request parameters. While making use of the default chat request parameters, I was getting an error, due to which we have specifically created the object of type OpenAI chat request parameters. Now if we see the response, this is how it is going to look like, wherein the query was, can you briefly tell me how you can help me? The response which is sent by the LLM is mapped here. Also it contains certain additional metadata. Now coming to our final endpoint, which is the get model info. This is the get type of endpoint that we have created for sending the metadata related to our chat model. So this is how the output is going to look like, wherein we will have the provider information, we will have the supported capabilities, we will have the default parameters that are set for our chat model. Also it will contain the information about the listeners. So if we expand this method, it is not accepting anything as the input. In order to send the output to the user, we have the map of string of object. First we are sending is the provider info. For this we are calling the chat model.provider, which will give the model provider type of object, and then we are extracting the name and setting it inside the key provider. So this is how it will look. Next we have the supported capabilities. In order to send the information related to the supported capabilities, we are calling the support capabilities method, which will give the set of capabilities, and from this particular set we are extracting the name, and once we have the capabilities name, we are simply setting it inside the supported capabilities, and similarly based on the list size we are setting the capabilities count. Next we have the default parameters that are set for our chat models. So for this we are calling the default request parameters, which will give the object of type chat request parameters. From this particular object we are extracting the parameters and we are setting it inside the different keys like model name, temperature, and so on. Then we have the information related to the listener. For that we are calling the listeners method on the chat model, which will give the list of chat model listeners. From this list we are simply getting the name of the listener and setting it inside the list. Once we have the list of listeners name, we are setting it inside the key with name registered listener, and based on the list of names we are simply setting the listener size. So this is how we have created the metadata endpoint, which contains certain details about the chat model. Yeah, so that was all regarding how we can make use of the chat model interface for interacting with the LLM. Now in order to test our endpoint, we will simply start our application. Now we will test our first endpoint, which is the simple chat endpoint. So for this we need to send the post request to API v1 chat simple. Inside the request body, we need to specify our query inside the field with name as message. Now when we will send the message, we should get the response from the DeepSeek R1 model. And in case of simple chat endpoint, we don't have any metadata, so we will only receive the AI response as the output. Also, if we go back to our application log, since we set these two flags to true for logging request and response, you will see the request was sent to the open router platform. The model name was DeepSeek R1. The query which is asked by the user is also mentioned here. And here you will see the response log. The response that we receive from the LLM is also mentioned here. So this is the entire response that we receive from the LLM. And if we go back to the Postman, so we receive the response inside the field with name AI response. Now coming to our second endpoint, which is with chat messages. Inside this we can set the list of messages to the LLM. So for this we have the endpoint API v1 chat with chat message. Inside the request body we can set the various type of messages like system message and the user message. So inside system message we have defined the role for the AI, and inside the user message we are asking the query. So in this case the LLM will try to be funny and accordingly it will send the response. So when we will send the request, we should see the response in a funny manner. So yeah, we have received the response from the LLM. Apart from this, we have also received the metadata. Coming to our next endpoint, which is the conversation endpoint. In this particular endpoint, we are sending the list of messages to the LLM. Also, we are maintaining the conversation context so that when the user asks the follow-up query, the LLM will be able to answer. Now here you will see first we have defined the role with the help of system message. Then the user has asked the first question. We receive the response from the LLM, and then the user is trying to ask the follow-up question. Since the entire conversation will be sent to the LLM will be able to answer the follow-up question. So when we will send the request, we should see the response. So here we have received the response. The previous result is 20 and the follow-up query is saying that multiply the result by 5. So the final answer is 100. So this is how we receive the response from the LLM. Also, we have received the metadata. Now coming to our next endpoint, which is the advanced chat endpoint. In this particular case, we can send the user message and the system message. Also, we can set the various parameters in order to fine tune the output which is produced by the LLM. So when we will send the request, we should get the expected output from the LLM. Also, we will get certain additional metadata. Yeah, so here you will see we have received the response from the LLM. Also, the metadata is present. Also, if we check the application log, we should see these parameter values are also sent to the LLM while making the request. So if we go to the application logs, here you will see while sending the request to the Open Router platform, DeepSeek R1 model, these particular parameters are also set. So coming to our next endpoint, which is the direct endpoint. This is the simple endpoint which is making use of doChat method behind the scenes. So inside the message field, we are simply asking the query. Yeah, we have received the response from the LLM. Also, certain additional metadata is mentioned in the response. Now coming to our final endpoint, which is the model info endpoint. This particular endpoint will return the metadata related to our chat model. So when we will send the request, we should see the expected response. Yeah, we have received the response. Here you will see the provider name is set as OpenAI since we added the OpenAI related dependency. Then the default parameters object is populated wherein the most of the values are set to null. Only the model name is populated. The reason why these values are appearing as null is we have not set any default parameters for our chat model, and if we have to do that, we can simply specify it inside the application YML or application properties. When it comes to the listener info, by default no listeners are registered with the chat model, due to which it is appearing as empty. Now I will showcase you one example. If we have to set the default parameters, how we can do that. Yeah, so this is how we can specify the default parameters for our chat module inside the application YML. Here you will see we have set the parameters like temperature, top P, penalty related information, stop sequence and so on. Now if we restart our application and send the request to the model info endpoint, we should see these values. Yeah, so our application is restarted. Now if we send the request, you will see these particular values are populated inside the default parameters. Yeah, so this was all regarding the chat model interface and how we can make use of the different methods that are present inside this interface. For this, we have written one detailed article which you can go through if you are interested. Also, the code base that we discussed during this tutorial is uploaded on GitHub. You can check out the code, set your Open Router API key and test the same. Yeah, so that's all from my end. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.